Last time we spoke about the Changsha fire. Chiang Kai-shek faced a brutal choice: defend Wuhan to the last man or flood the land to slow the invaders. He chose both, pushing rivers and rallying a fractured army as Japanese forces pressed along the Yangtze. Fortresses at Madang held long, but the cost was quite high. Troops lost, civilians displaced, a city's heart burning in the night. Wuhan fell after months of brutal fighting, yet the battle did not break China's will. Mao Zedong urged strategy over martyrdom, preferring to drain the enemy and buy time for a broader struggle. The Japanese, though victorious tactically, found their strength ebbing. Resources strained, supplies were gapped, and the war was feeling endless. In the wake of Wuhan, Changsha stood next in the Japanese crosshairs, its evacuation and a devastating fire leaving ash and memory in its wake. Behind these prices, political currents swirled. Wang Jingwei defected yet again, seeking power beyond Chiang Kai-shek's grasp, while Chongqing rose as a Western bastion of resistance. This episode is the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and could you also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we're about to release another mini-series covering the Battle of the Atlantic. And if you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 37 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. So based on the title of this one, you probably can see we're going to be taking a bit of a detour. For quite some time now, we've focused on the Japanese campaigns in China proper, 1937 to 1938. Now, the way the Second Sino-Japanese War is traditionally broken down is actually in phases. 1937 to 1938 is the first phase, 39 to 42 is the second phase, and then the rest is phase 3. However, there's actually even more going on in China aside from the war with Japan. In Xinjiang province, a large full-blown Islamic revolution breaks out in 1937, for example. And we will be covering that story at a later date. But another significant event is escalating, which is border skirmishes along Manchuria. Now, these border skirmishes have been actually raging ever since the USSR consolidated its hold over the Far East. We've actually talked about a bit of this history, like the Sino-Soviet War in 1929. However, when Japan created the puppet government of Manchuria, this was a significant escalation in tensions with the Reds. Today we're going to be beginning this story about the escalating border conflicts between the Soviets and the Japanese. A tongue of poorly demarcated land extends southeast from Honchun, hugging the eastern banks of the Tumen River between Lake Khasan to the east and Korea to the west. Within this tongue stands Changfukeng Hill, one of a long chains of highlands sweeping from upstream along the rivers and the moors towards the sea. The twin-peaked hill sits at a confluence area several miles northwest of the point where Manchuria, Korea, and the Russian Far East meets. The hill's shape reminded Koreans of their chongguo, which is a long snare drum constricted at the center and tapped with hands at each end. When the Manchus came to the Tumen, they rendered the phonetic sounds into 3 ideographic characters meaning "ta drum peaks," or chongguo feng. The Japanese admired this imagery and preserved the Chinese readings, which they pronounce as "cho ko ho." From their eastern vantage, the Russians called it Zalzonaya, hill behind the lake. Soviet troops referred to it as Sugarloaf Hill. For many years, natives and a handful of officials in the region cultivated a relaxed attitude towards the borders and the sovereignty of the area. Even after the Japanese seized Manchuria in 1931, the issue did not immediately come to a head. With the expansion of Manchukuo and the Soviet Far East under Stalin's 5-year plans, both sides began to attend more closely to the frontier delimitation. Whenever either party acted aggressively, force majeure was invoked to justify the unexpected and disruptive events recognized in international law. Most often, these incidents erupted along the eastern Manchurian borders with the USSR or along the 350-mile frontier south of Lake Kanka, each skirmish carrying the seeds of an all-out war. Now, before we really get into this, we have to talk a little bit about the border history. The borders in question essentially dated back to pacts concluded by the Qing dynasty and the Tsardom. Between the First Sino-Russian Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 and the Mukden Agreement of 1924, there were over a dozen accords governing the borders. Relevant to Changfukeng were the basic 15-article Convention of Peking, supplementing the Tientsin Treaties of November of 1860. There was also some maps made in 1861, and the 8-article Hunchun Border Protocol of 1886. By the 1860 treaty, the Qing had ceded to the Tsardom the entire maritime province of Siberia, but the meaning of lands south of Lake Kanka remained rather vague. Consequently, a further border agreement was negotiated in June of 1861, known as the Lake Kanka Border Pact, by which the demarcations were drawn on maps and 8 wooden markers were erected. The border was to run from Kanka along ridgelines between the Hunchun River and the sea, past Suifan-ho and Tongning, terminating about 6 miles from the mouth of the Tumen. Then a Russo-Sino Commission, established in 1886, drew up the Hunchun Border Pact, proposing new or modified markers along the 1860 to 1861 lines and arranging a Russian resurvey. However, for the Japanese in 1938, the Chinese or Manchu texts of 1886's Honshu Agreement were considered rather controlling. To be rather blunt, they just didn't want to agree to anything the Soviets wanted. And the Soviets, they argued the border ran along every summit west of Khasan, thereby granting them jurisdiction over at least the eastern slopes of all the elevations. And that would include Changfukeng and Xiaqiaofeng. Since the Qing dynasty and the House of Romanov were already defunct, the new sovereignties publicly appealed to the opposing texts, and the Soviet side would not concede that the Russian language version had never actually been deemed binding by the Qing. Yet, even in 1938, the Japanese knew that only the Chinese texts had actually survived or could be located. Now, both the Chinese and Russian military maps generally drew the frontier along the watershed east of Khasan. This aligned with the 1861 readings based on the Kanka Agreement. The Chinese Republican Army conducted new surveys sometime between 1915 and 1920. The latest Chinese military maps of the Changfukeng area drew the border considerably closer to the old Red Line of 1886, running west of Khasan, but near the shore rather than traversing the highland crests. None of the military delimitations of the border were sanctioned by an official agreement. Hence, the Hunchun Protocol, whether well known or not, invaluable or worthless, remained the only government-to-government pact dealing with the frontiers. Now, I just want to go through a little bit on the history of Soviet-Japanese border conflicts. The first major conflict would, obviously be the entire Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Following years of conflict between the Russian Empire and Japan, culminating in the costly Battle of Tsushima and Mukden, Tsar Nicholas II's government sought peace, recognizing Japan's claims to Korea and agreeing to evacuate Manchuria. From 1918 to 1920, the Imperial Japanese Army, under Emperor Taisho, after the death of Emperor Meiji, assisted the White Army and Alexander Kerensky against the Bolshevik Red Army. They also aided the Czechoslovak Legion in Siberia to facilitate its return to Europe after an Austrian-Hungarian armored train purportedly went astray. By 1920, with Austria-Hungary dissolved and Czechoslovakia established 2 years earlier, the Czechoslovak Legion reached Europe. Japan withdrew from the Russian Revolution and the Civil War in 1922. Following Japan's 1919 to 1920 occupations and the Soviet intervention in Mongolia in 1921, the Republic of China also withdrew from Outer Mongolia in 1921. In 1922, after capturing Vladivostok in 1918 to halt the Bolshevik advances, Japanese forces retreated to Japan as Bolshevik power grew and the post-war fatigue amongst all the combatants increased. After Hirohito's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to 1932, following Taisho's death in 1926, border disputes between Manchukuo, the Mongolian People's Republic, and the Soviet Union increased. Many clashes stemmed from poorly defined borders, though some involved espionage. Between 1932 and 1934, the Imperial Japanese Army reported 152 border disputes, largely tied to Soviet intelligence activity in Manchuria, while the Soviets accused Japan of 15 border violations, 6 air intrusions, and 20 cases of spy smuggling in 1933 alone. Numerous additional violations followed in the ensuing years. By the mid-1930s, Soviet-Japanese diplomacy and trust had deteriorated further, with the Japanese being openly labeled fascist enemies at the 7th Comintern Congress in July of 1935. Beginning in 1935, conflicts significantly escalated. On January the 8th of 1935, the first armored clash, known as the Halhamiao incident, took place on the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo. Several dozen cavalrymen of the Mongolian People's Army crossed into Manchuria near disputed fishing grounds and engaged an 11-man Manchukuo Imperial Army patrol near the Buddhist temple at Halhamiao, led by a Japanese military advisor. The Manchukuo Army sustained 6 wounded and 2 dead, including the Japanese officer. The Mongols suffered no casualties, and they withdrew after the Japanese sent a punitive expedition to reclaim the area. 2 motorized cavalry companies, a machine gun company, and a tankette platoon occupied the position for about 3 weeks without any resistance. In June of 1935, the first direct exchange of fire between the Japanese and Soviets occurred when an 11-man Japanese patrol west of Lake Hanka was attacked by 6 Soviet horsemen, reportedly inside Manchukuo territory. During a firefight, 1 Soviet soldier was killed and 2 horses were captured. The Japanese requested a joint investigation, but the Soviets rejected the proposal. In October of 1935, 9 Japanese and 32 Manchukuoan border guards were establishing a post about 20 kilometers north of Suetaka when they were attacked by 50 Soviet soldiers. The Soviets opened fire with rifles and heavy machine guns. 2 Japanese and 4 Manchukuoan soldiers were killed, another 5 were wounded. The Manchukuoan Foreign Affairs representative lodged a verbal protest with the Soviet consul at Suetaka. The Kwangtung Army also sent an intelligence officer to investigate the clash. On December the 19th, a Manchukuoan unit was doing some reconnaissance southwest of Blurrier Lake, and they clashed with a Mongolian party, reportedly capturing about 10 soldiers. 5 days later, 60 truck-borne Mongolian troops assaulted the Manchukuoans, but they were repulsed, yet still at the cost of about 3 Manchukuoan deaths. On that same day, at Brunders, Mongolian forces attempted 3 times to drive out Manchukuoan outposts, and again at night, but these attempts all failed. Further small attempts occurred in January, with Mongolians using airplanes for reconnaissance. The arrival of a small Japanese force in 3 trucks helped foil these attempts. Casualties occurred on both sides, though Mongolian casualties are unknown aside from 10 prisoners taken. Then in February of 1936, Lieutenant Colonel Sugimoto Yasuo was ordered to form a detachment from the 14th Cavalry Regiment to, quote, drive the outer Mongol intruders from the Olankunduk region, a directive attributed to Lieutenant General Kazuo Hijiro. Sugimoto's detachment included cavalry guns, heavy machine guns, and tankettes. They faced a force of about 140 Mongolians equipped with heavy machine guns and some very small artillery. On February the 12th, Sugimoto's men drove the Mongolians south at the cost of 8 Japanese killed, 4 wounded, and 1 tankette destroyed. The Japanese began to withdraw, but they were attacked by 5 to 6 Mongolian armored cars and 2 bombers, which briefly disrupted the column. The situation was stabilized when the Japanese unit received artillery support, allowing them to destroy or repel the armored cars. In March of 1936, the Taran incident occurred. Now, in this clash, both the Japanese army and the Mongolian army deployed a small number of armored fighting vehicles and aircraft. The incident began when 100 Mongolian and 6 Soviet troops attacked and occupied the disputed village of Taran. This is actually in Mongolia, driving off a small Manchurian garrison there. They were supported by light bombers and some armored cars, though the bombing sorties failed to inflict damage on the Japanese. Now, 3 bombers were actually shot down by Japanese heavy machine guns. Local Japanese forces counterattacked, conducting dozens of bombing sorties, and finally assaulted Taran with about 400 men and 10 tankettes. The result was a Mongolian rout, with 56 Mongolian soldiers killed, including 3 Soviet advisors, and an unknown number of wounded. Japanese losses were about 27 killed and 9 wounded. Later in March, another border clash occurred between the Japanese and the Soviet forces. Reports of border violations prompted the Japanese Korean army to send 10 men by truck to investigate, but the patrol was ambushed by 20 Soviet NKVD soldiers deployed about 300 meters inside territory claimed by the Japanese. After suffering several casualties, the Japanese patrol withdrew and was reinforced with about 100 men, who then drove off the Soviets. Fighting resumed later that day when the NKVD brought reinforcements. By nightfall, the fighting had ceased and both sides had pulled back. The Soviets agreed to return the bodies of 2 Japanese soldiers who had died in the fighting, a development viewed by the Japanese government as at least encouraging. In early April of 1936, 3 Japanese soldiers were killed near Suetaka in another minor affray. This incident was notable because the Soviets again returned the bodies of the fallen servicemen. In June of 1937, the Kanchazu Island incident occurred on the Amur River along the Soviet-Manchukuo border. Here, 3 Soviet gunboats crossed the river's center line, disembarked troops, and occupied Kanchazu Island. Forces from the IJ's 1st Division, equipped with 2 horse-drawn 37mm artillery pieces, quickly established improvised firing positions and loaded their guns with both high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. They shelled the Soviet vessels, sinking the lead gunboat, crippling the second and driving off the third. Japanese troops subsequently fired on the swimming crewmen from the sunken ships using machine guns. 37 Soviet soldiers were gunned down. The Japanese took no casualties. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs protested and demanded the Soviet forces withdraw from the island. The Soviet leadership, apparently shocked by this incident and reluctant to escalate, agreed to evacuate their troops. By 1938, the border situation had deteriorated quite a lot. To be honest, it had been centuries-long maps and these treaties and the terrain features. They feature mountains, bogs, streams, forests, and valleys. Well, it's very complicated for observers to figure out where the hell the old red line was drawn from, 1886. About 50 years later, the markers themselves had undergone a metamorphosis. Japanese investigators could find at most about 14 of the 17 markers standing fairly intact between the Tumen estuary and Kanka, roughly 1 for every 25 miles. The remainder were missing, or maybe they were destroyed. 5 were found in new locations. Marker K, for example, was 40 meters deeper inside Manchuria, away from Kanka. Japanese military experts noted that of the 20 markers originally set along the boundaries of the Hunshin prefecture alone, only 4 could be found by the summer of 1938. The rest had been wrecked or moved, perhaps by the Russians, or the Chinese officials, no one knew. It is even said that 1 missing marker could be seen on display in Khabarovsk. The Chinese had generally interpreted the boundary as a road line just west of Kazan, at least in practice. Free road movement, however, had become quite a problem, even 20 years before the Japanese overran Manchuria in 1931. The Japanese adopted or inherited the Chinese interpretation, which was, of course, based on the 1886 agreement. Japanese sources emphasize that local residents, angered towards gradual Soviet oppression and penetrations westward into Manchurian territory, fueled the conflict. Many natives believe the original boundaries lay east of the lake, but the Soviets adjusted the situation to suit their own convenience. In practice, the Russians were restricting road use just west of Kazan by Manchurian and Korean residents. There was speculation that this was a prelude to taking over the ridge lines, depending on the reaction of the Manchukuoan Japanese side. Villagers who went to streams or the lake to launder clothing found themselves subjected to sniper fire. Along a 25-mile stretch of road near Jiaqiaofang, farmers reported coming under fire from new Soviet positions as early as November of 1935. Nevertheless, Japanese and Koreans familiar with the Tumen area noted agrarian seasonal Korean religious sites atop Changfukeng, including fattened pigs sacrificed and Changguo drums beaten. Village elders told Japanese visitors in 1938 that until early in the preceding year, no Russians had come as far as Changfukeng Hill. Now, looking only at the border section around Changfukeng, the easy days were clearly behind everybody. In the summer of 1938, Gaimusho, the foreign ministry, observers described the explosive situation along the Korean-Manchuria-USSR borders as a matter of de facto frontiers. Both sides pressed against each other, and their triggy-happy posture was summed up by the colloquial refrain, "Take another step, and we'll let you have it." Around dawn on June the 13th of 1938, a Manchurian patrol detected a suspicious figure in the fog swirling over Changfukeng Hill on the Siberian-Manchurian frontier. Challenged at 15 feet, the suspect hurled 2 pistols to the ground and raised his hands in surrender. At headquarters, the police soon realized that this was no routine border trespassing case. The man was a defector, and he was a Russian general. In fact, he was the director of all NKVD forces in the Soviet Far East. Beneath a mufti of spring coat and a hunting cap, he wore a full uniform with medals. His identification card was number 83, designating him as J.S. Lushkov, Commissar 3rd Class, countersigned by Nikolai Yuzhov, NKVD head in Moscow. Lushkov was promptly turned over to the Japanese military authorities, who transferred him to Seoul and then to Tokyo under a very close escort. July the 1st, the Japanese press was permitted to disclose that Lushkov had sought refuge in Japan. 10 days later, to capitalize on the commissar's notoriety and to confound skeptics, the Japanese produced Lushkov at a press conference in Tokyo. For the Japanese and the foreign correspondents who met separately with him, Lushkov described Soviet Far East strength and the turmoil racking the USSR, because for those of you unfamiliar, this was during the Stalinist purges. Clearly, the Japanese had gained a unique reservoir of high-level intelligence and a wealth of materials, including notes scratched in blood by suspects incarcerated at Khabarovsk. A general tightening of the Russian frontier security had recently been reported. Natives of Fangzhongting asserted that a Soviet cavalry patrol appeared in June, seemingly for the first time. Contact with Yangguangping, northwest of Khasan, was severed. More importantly, Japanese Army Signal Corps intelligence detected a surge of Soviet message traffic from Poziet Bay District. After Lushkov's defection, a drastic reshuffle in the local Russian command apparently occurred, and responsibility for border surveillance seems to have been relocated. Japanese records indicated that the Novokhovsk Security Force commander was relieved, and the sector garrison was replaced by troops from Vladivostok. Gamuso intelligence also received reports that a border garrison unit had been transferred from Khabarovsk or Chita to the Tumen sector. The Kwangtung Army signal monitors also intercepted 2 significant frontline messages on the 6th of July from the new Russian local commander in the Poziet region, addressed to Lieutenant General Sokolov in Khabarovsk. Decoded, the messages suggested: Number 1. That ammunition for infantry mortars amounted to less than half the required supply. And number 2, a recommendation that higher headquarters authorize Russian elements to secure certain unoccupied high grounds west of Khasan. The commander also noted terrain advantages and the contemplated construction of emplacements that would command Najin and the Korean Railway. As a start, at least one Russian platoon should be authorized to dig in on the highest ground, that was presumably Changfukeng, deploy about 4 tons of entanglements to stake out a Soviet claim. Korean Army headquarters received a telegram from the Kwangtung Army on the 7th of July, conveying the deciphered message. On that same day, the 19th Division in North Korea telephoned Seoul that, on July the 6th, 3 to 4 Soviet horsemen had been observed doing a reconnaissance on the Manchurian territory from atop a hill called Changfukeng. The alarming intelligence from the Kwangtung Army and the front warranted immediate attention by the Korean Army. Some Kwangtung Army officers doubted the significance of the developments, with one intelligence official even suggesting the Russian messages might be a deliberate ploy designed to entrap the Japanese at Changfukeng. On the 7th of July, all staff officers in Seoul convened at Army headquarters. The name of Changfukeng Hill was not well known to them, but maps and other data suggested that neither the Japanese nor the Russians had previously stationed border units in the ridge west of Kasan. As early as March of 1936, Army Commander Koizu Kanaki had distributed maps to subordinate units, indicating which sectors were under dispute. No patrol was to enter these zones, lacking any definitive demarcation. Until then, the only Japanese element east of the Tumen was a Manchurian policeman at Fangchuangting. Ownership of the high ground emerged as an early issue. A number of other points were also raised by the Kwangtung Army. Number 1. At present, Soviet elements in the area were negligible. Number 2. The intrusion must not be overlooked. The Russians could be expected to exploit any weakness, and half measures would not suffice, especially regarding the Japanese defense mission along a 125-mile frontier. Number 3. In Japanese hands, Changfukeng Hill would be rather useful, but 2 excellent observation posts already existed in the neighboring sector of the Manchurian tongue. Number 4. With dissidents and purges underway, the Russians may have judged it necessary to seal border gaps, particularly after Lushkov's defection. They may also have sought to control Changfukeng to offset Japanese dominance of the high ground to the north. Number 5. Soviet seizure of Changfukeng would upset the delicate status quo and could provoke a contest for equivalent observation posts. Number 6. In broader terms, it mattered little whether the Russians sought a permanent observation post on Changfukeng Hill, which was of relatively minor strategic value. Japan's primary concern lay in the China theater. Changfukeng was peripheral. The Japanese should not expend limited resources or become distracted. Number 7. The matter required consultation with High Command in Tokyo. In the absence of a more comprehensive intelligence, the assembled staff officers concluded that the Korea Army should, at minimum, ignore or disregard Soviet actions for the time being, while maintaining vigilant observation of the area. The consensus was communicated to Major General Gitanto Kenzo, the Korean Army Chief of Staff, who concurred, and to Koizo. Upon learning that the recommendation advocated a low posture, Koizo inquired only whether the opinion reflected the unanimous view of the staff. Having been assured that it did, he approved the policy. Now, Koizo was about 58 years old. He was on the threshold of routine personnel changes that were going to be occurring on July 15th. He had just been informed that he would be retiring and that General Nakimura Kataro would succeed him. Those acquainted with Koizo perceived him as treating the border difficulties as a minor anticlimax in the course of his command tour. He appeared unempathetic or relaxed as he prepared to depart from his post that he had held for about 21 years. Although neither Koizo nor his staff welcomed the Soviet activities that appeared underway, his reaction likely reflected a reluctance to make decisions that could constrain his soon-to-arrive successor. On the 8th of July, Koizo authorized the dispatch of warnings to the 19th Division at Nanam, to the Huanchun garrison, and to the intelligence branch at Huanchun. These units were instructed to exercise maximum precautions and to tighten frontier security north of Shilianfeng. In response to the initial appearance of Soviet horsemen at Changfukeng, the Kuchang Border Garrison Unit of the 76th Infantry Regiment maintained close surveillance across the Tumen. By about noon on July the 9th, patrols detected approximately a dozen Russian troops commencing construction atop Changfukeng. Between the 11th and the 13th of July, the number of soldiers on the slopes increased to 40. There were also 30 horses and 11 camouflage tents. Operating in shifts on the western side, 30 meters from the crest, the Russians erected barbed wire and firing trenches. 50 meters forward, they excavated observation trenches. In addition to existing telephone lines between Changfukeng, Lake Hassan, and Kosando, the Russians installed a portable telephone net. Logistical support was provided by 3 boats on the lake. Approximately 12 kilometers to the east, well within Soviet territory, large forces were also being mobilized, and steamship traffic into Poziet Bay intensified. Upon learning of the intrusion at Changfukeng on the 9th of July, Lieutenant General Suetaka, the commander of the 19th Division, dispatched staff officers to the front and prepared to send elements to reinforce the border units. The special significance of Suetaka and his division stemmed from a series of unusual circumstances. Jiantao Province, the same zone under which Lushkov had fled into, and the sector where Soviet horsemen had actually appeared, fell within Manchukuo geographically and administratively. Yet in terms of defense, the configuration of the frontier, the terrain, and the transportation network more closely connected the region with North Korea than with southeastern Manchuria. Approximately 80% of the population was of Korean origin, which implied Japanese rather than Manchukuoan allegiances. Consequently, the Korean army had been made operationally responsible for the defense of Jiantao and controlled not only the 3-battalion garrison at Honcheon, but also the intelligence detachment located there. In the event of war, the Korean Army's mission was defined as mobilization and execution of subsidiary operations tasked against the USSR, under the control and in the support of the Kwangtung Army. The Korea Army ordinarily possessed 2 infantry divisions, the 19th in North Korea and the 20th stationed at Seoul, but the 20th Division had already departed for China, leaving just the 20th Depot Division in the capital. Beyond sparse ground units devoid of any armor with weak heavy artillery, there were only 2 air regiments in Korea, the nearest being the unit at Huryong. The Korea Army was designed to maintain public security within Korea, as well as fulfill minimal defensive responsibilities. Such an army did not require a full-time operations officer, and none was maintained. When needed, as in mid-1938, the task would fall to the senior staff officer, in this case, Colonel Iwasaki Tamio. Thus, the 19th Division was entrusted with defending northeastern Korea. Its commander, Suetaka, a seasoned infantryman, resented the fact that his elite force had never actually engaged in combat in China. He intensified training with some zeal, emphasizing strict discipline, bravery, aggressiveness, and thorough preparation. Japanese veterans characterized him as rather severe, bullish, short-tempered, very hot-blooded, highly strung, unbending, and quite a stubborn man. Nonetheless, there was widespread respect for his realistic training program, maintained under firm, even violent, personal supervision. His men regarded Suetaka as a professional, a modern samurai who forged the division into superb condition. Privately, he was reputed for sensitivity and warmth. A Japanese phrase known as yakamashi oyaji captures the dual sense of a stern father and a martinet in character. At the outset, however, Suetaka displayed little aggression. Although not widely known, he did not welcome the orders from the Army headquarters to deploy to Tumen. Until late July, he remained somewhat opposed to the notion of dislodging the Soviets from the crest, a proposition arising from neither the division staff nor initially Suetaka himself. Colonel Sato noted that for a week after reports of Soviet excavation at Changfukeng, the division's response was limited to preparations for a possible emergency, as they perceived the matter as a local issue best suited through diplomacy. Korea Army officers acknowledged that around that time the Soviets consolidated their outpost. Strength at Changfukeng, an informal and personal telegram arrived in Seoul from the Kwangtung Army intelligence field-grade officers who specialized in Soviet affairs. If the Korea Army hesitated, the Kwangtung Army would be obliged to eject the Russians. Thus, the matter could not be ignored. While the telegram did not demand a reply, and struck several officers as presumptuous and implausible, the message was promptly shown to Koizo. Koizo was driven to immediate action. He wired Tokyo asserting that only the Korea Army could and would handle the incident. One staff officer recalled, "We felt we had to act, out of a sense of responsibility, but we resented the Kwangtung Army's interference." The Korea Army staff convened shortly after a receipt of the unofficial telegram came from Xinqing. Based on the latest intelligence from the division dated the 13th of July, the officers prepared an assessment for submission to the Army commander. Number 1. The USSR, or the Far East authorities, desired hostilities. Conclusion, slightly possible. Number 2. The USSR seeks to restrain Japan on the eve of the pivotal operations in China, the major Japanese offensive to seize Hankou. Conclusion: highly probable. Number 3. The Pozieres district commander is new in his post. By occupying the Changfukeng ridges, he would demonstrate loyalty, impress his superiors, and seek glory. Conclusion: possible. Late on the 13th, or early on the 14th, Guizhou approved the dispatch of a message to the Vice Minister of War and the Kwangtung Army Chief of Staff. Lake Khasan area lies in troublesome sector in the USSR that they've been claiming. In accordance with treaties, said of the secret message from number 913, we are to interpret it to be a Manchurian territory, evident even from the maps published by the Soviet side. Russian actions are patently illegal, but considering that the area does not exert major or immediate influence on operations Japan is intending and that the China incident is in full swing, we are not going to conduct counterattack measures immediately. This army is thinking of reasoning with the Soviets and requesting pullback directly on the spot. In case Russians do not accede in the long run, we have intention to drive Soviet soldiers out of the area east of Khasan firmly by the use of force. The message concluded with a request that the Tokyo authorities launch a formal protest with the USSR on behalf of Manchukuo and Japan, and guide matters so that the Russians would withdraw quickly. Now, dominant in the Japanese high command thinking in 1938 was, of course, the China theater. The Changfukeng episode constituted, much more of a mere digression. A sequence of Japanese tactical victories had preceded the summer. Qingdao had fallen in January, the Yellow River was reached in March, a reformed government of the Republic of China was installed at Nanjing several weeks earlier. Amoy fell in early May, Suzhou fell on the 20th. With these gains, northern and central fronts could be linked by the Japanese. Yet Chinese resistance persisted, and while public statements anticipated imminent Chinese dissension, private admissions acknowledged that the partial effects of Suzhou's fall were ominous. Control might actually pass from Chiang Kai-shek to the communists. Chinese defiance might intensify, and Soviet involvement could ensue. A Hankou Drive appeared desirable to symbolize the conclusion of the military phase of hostilities. The Japanese and their adversaries were in accord regarding the importance of the summer and autumn campaigns. Even after Suzhou's fall, the government discouraged public insinuations that enemy resistance was collapsing. When Chiang Kai-shek addressed the nation on the first anniversary of hostilities, Premier Konoye prophetically proclaimed, "The war has just begun." Colonel Inaida Masazume served as the Army General Staff principal figure for the Changfukeng affair, occupying the position of Chief of the 2nd Operations Section within the Operations Bureau in March of 1938. A distinguished graduate of the Military Academy, Inaida completed the War College program and he held a combination of line, instructional, and staff assignments at the War College, the Army General Staff, and the War Ministry. He was recognized as a sharp, highly capable, and driveful personality, though some regarded him as enigmatic. Following the capture of Suzhou, Imperial General Headquarters on June 18th ordered field forces to undertake operational preparations for a drive to seize the Wuhan complex. Inaida favored a decisive move aimed at achieving a rapid political settlement. He acknowledged that the Soviet intervention in 1938 during Japan's involvement in China would have been quite critical. Although Japanese forces still could defeat the Chinese, an overextended Japanese army might be fatally compromised against the Russians. Soviet assistance to China was already pronouncedly unwelcome. The Soviets were reported to possess roughly 20 rifle divisions, 4 to 5 cavalry divisions, 1,500 tanks, and over 1,560 aircraft, including 300 bombers with a range of approximately 3,000 kilometers, enabling reach from Vladivostok to Tokyo. Soviet manpower in Siberia was likely near 370,000. In response, Japanese central authorities stressed a no-trouble policy towards the USSR, while seeking to wall off the border and bolster the Kwangtung Army as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, the correction of the strategic imbalance could not occur before 1943, given shortages in ammunition, manpower, and materials across existing theaters in China. By the end of 1937, Japan had committed 16 of its 24 divisions to China, bringing the standing force to roughly 700,000. Army General Staff planners relocated about 3 ground divisions, intended for a northern contingency, from north to central China, even as the Kwangtung Army operated with a less than favorable posture. Attitudes towards the northern problem varied within senior military circles. While concern persisted, it was not universal. As campaigns in China widened, planning at the high command level deteriorated, propagating confusion and anxiety to field armies within China. The Japanese Navy suspected that the Army General Staff was invoking the USSR as a pretext for broader strategic aims, namely to provoke a more consequential confrontation with the USSR, while the Navy contended with its own strategic rivalries with the Army, centered on the United States and Britain. Army leaders, however, denied aggressive intent against the USSR at that time. The Hankou Plan encountered substantial internal opposition at high levels. Private assessments among Army planners suggested that a two-front war would be premature given operational readiness and troop strength. Not only were the new War Ministry officials cautious, but many high-ranking Army General Staff officers and court circulars shared doubts. Aggressive tendencies influenced by subordinates and the Kwangtung Army were evident in Inada, who repeatedly pressed Tadashun, the Deputy Army Chief of Staff, to endorse the Wuhan Drive as both necessary and feasible, arguing that the USSR would gain from Japan's weakening without incurring substantial losses. Inada contended that Stalin was rational, and that time favored the USSR in the Far East, where industrial buildup and military modernization were ongoing. He argued that the Soviet purges impeded opportunistic ventures with Japan. He posited that Nazi Germany posed a growing threat on the Western Front, and thus the USSR should be avoided by both Japan, due to China, and Russia, due to Germany. While most of the army remained engaged in China, Dada did not initially share Inada's views. Only after inspecting the Manchurian borders in April of 1938 did he finally align with Inada's broader vision, which encompassed both northern and Chinese considerations. During this period, Inada studied daily intelligence from the Kwangtung Army, and after Lushkov's defection in June, reports suggested the Soviets were following their sector commander's recommendations. Russian troops appeared at Changfukeng, seemingly prepared to dig in. Inada recalled his initial reaction as this: "That's nice. My chance has come." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. The simmering Soviet-Japanese border clashes centered around Changfukeng Hill, near Lake Kanka, set within a broader history of contested frontiers dating to the Qing and Tsardoms. Japan, prioritizing China, considered Changfukeng peripheral, but ready to confront Soviet encroachment. Moscow aimed to consolidate border gains, with high-level war planning overlaying regional skirmishes. Needless to say, conflict was looming over Manchuria again.